Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this second session. Today we'll be discussing loss and damage, and conducting the session will be, again, Dr. Christopher Bartlett. So for those who are just joining in for the first time, Dr. Christopher Bartlett is a UNFCCC negotiator for Vanuatu and a freelance climate and environmental expert. He has worked extensively in government, civil society, communities, and the private sector. His research interests include innovative and science-based solutions and strategies for dealing with climate change in the Pacific. Dr. Chris, the floor is yours again.
Thank you, Atina, and good morning, everyone. Again, I'm so sorry that you have to listen to me for 2 consecutive sessions, but I promise once this is over, you don't have to hear my voice again. So yes, my area of negotiation for Vanuatu since COP, my goodness, I'm going to tell you how old I am. COP 18 was my first COP, and it actually started with loss and damage. So I have been following this issue for many, many years, and have been fortunate to see the development of the Warsaw International Mechanism, as well as the Santiago Network, and how this topic has played out. And I'm also honored to have been able to serve Vanuatu, which, as I mentioned in the previous talks, was really a leader in getting the idea of loss and damage within the UNFCCC convention discussions way back in 1991. So in terms of this year at COP, I am very certain that loss and damage is going to play one of these key kind of package roles. And I know that decisions on loss and damage are going to be held up while we have decisions in some of the other areas. And I know the loss and damage is going to hold up decisions in other areas as well. So what is loss and damage? What is this crazy topic that we're all so interested in here in the Pacific? I think it comes down to the fact that climate change is not a future scenario. It is already absolutely destroying, disrupting our lives and our lands and our livelihoods here in the Pacific and around the world. And while the convention and the Paris Agreement both agree that we need to rapidly cut emissions and we need to rapidly upscale adaptation, there is a big but. And that big but is that some of the impacts no one can adapt to. They have breached the limits of what is possible. And that is loss and damage. So what is the official definition that I can give you that is codified within the UNFCCC? Well, there is no formal definition. So we still, to this day, 22nd of September 2021, have no formal definition of loss and damage under the UNFCCC framework. And this makes it very challenging to negotiate around things like the Warsaw International Mechanism or the Santiago Network on loss and damage when we don't actually have a clear understanding of what this phrase means. There have been some definitions used in different places. For example, the IPCC, they refer to loss and damage as the residual impacts of climate change, or the residual costs of not doing enough mitigation. Anything beyond mitigation adaptation is residual, is loss and damage. There have also been use of the phrase losses and damages, which would be in plural lowercase, which refers to kind of the actual impacts and the possible risks to real systems. And then there's the capital LND, loss and damage, which refers to the policy debate within UNFCCC. So even that's got some different understanding. Then we talk often about the 2 words themselves. So loss being loss that cannot be recovered. Once it's lost, it's gone, being a loss. And then damage is something that has been impacted, but that there can be some sort of recovery. So you have the loss side and the damage side. You hear people talking about hard and soft limits to adaptation. A hard limit means the sea has risen past your infrastructure. There's nothing else you can do. And then a soft limit would be kind of strategies that are no longer available to you because of the context change or finance or technology. So there's hard and soft limits to adaptation. And then we often talk about economic versus non-economic losses and damages. Economic, of course, meaning any item which is commonly traded in the market, or where a market value can be assigned, would be an economic type of loss and damage, or non-economic, where market values just simply can't be assigned. And I want to spend a little bit more time on what this actually looks like, particularly for us in the Pacific. So one example of loss and damage in the Pacific could be livelihoods that are deteriorated because of strong droughts and all the crops die, or a loss of territory because of sea level rise. You've actually lost your land. This could be an example of loss and damage in the Pacific. Another example would be these extreme flooding events that we're experiencing in many urban centers around the Pacific and rural areas, leading to loss of both property, which commonly happens, and lives, which unfortunately also happens in the Pacific. That is loss and damage. Heat waves that we experience during the El Nino drought events and water scarcity, which could lead to food insecurity and a loss of ecosystems, that is loss and damage in the Pacific. Sea level rise, coastal flooding, loss of soils, that is loss and damage in the Pacific. So we are, if you're looking for a poster child of loss and damage around the world, you really don't have to look beyond the Pacific to see pretty much all of it. We experience some more form or other. And I just wanted to very quickly show you this video that was put out by IIED, which is looking at loss and damage in various regions of the world, but they did a loss and damage segment here in the Pacific. So let me turn this on. It's called The Untold Stories, only 2 minutes, Untold Stories of Climate Change, and specifically focused on the Solomon Islands. So let me click on this, and I'm going to share my sound, and I'm going to optimize video, and I'm going to share. So hopefully you should be able to see this. Can everybody see the video, Tina?
We used to cope with storms. We built coastal walls of stone, planted mangroves, and constructed houses on higher stilts. But these efforts had their limits. Now cyclones hit the Solomon Islands every season, powerful enough to cripple our economy overnight. With rising sea levels, our islands are sinking, some completely submerged, and with them, fundamental parts of our history, identity, and culture, trapped underwater, gone forever.
Climate change is often called the biggest injustice of our generation. The least developed countries like ours have emitted the tiniest fraction of the planet-warming gases that drive climate change. Yet, we are 5 times more likely to lose our lives from climate-related disasters.
Salt from the encroaching waves poisons our fresh water and forces people to travel great distances to find water for drinking and cooking.
Our coral reefs, home to thousands of marine species, are dying, and with them, the protein that sustains us. The losses we are experiencing from climate change are irreplaceable. This damage is irreparable. As our water and land disappears, whole communities are forced to relocate.
Some forced to squat illegally, exacerbating tensions between ethnic groups, which makes us afraid we will revisit the violent conflicts of the past that labeled our country a failing state.
We are worried about our country's future. Recognizing our deep and personal losses, governments must prioritize the climate crisis and agree a clear plan to address loss and damage that provides desperately needed support through finance and technology.
We must avert conflict and safeguard humanity. We cannot let climate change cause more states to fail. We must act now.
Okay, so I think that was a really powerful visualization of loss and damage. And I think it's also really important that we recognize that it's not just about an impact on infrastructure or an impact on a garden. But what this video did was it talked about the interlinkages between and among impacts that is really transforming our culture and our identities and our lives that are irreparable and irreplaceable. And that gets to the heart of what climate loss and damage really is. I've also noticed that the world doesn't quite understand loss and damage in the way that we do in the Pacific. And the more that we can share those real stories of what loss and damage actually means in our lives, then the further we can progress the negotiations on loss and damage. Sometimes it's very hard for someone from the global north or the Western world to imagine how ecosystem services provide for your daily subsistence needs. And by explaining with pictures and graphics and imageries and stories, this will be very important. So I really appreciate Gladys and Solomon and IED for that movie. Okay, let's go on to the next slide here. I wanted to go into two different types of events which commonly cause loss and damage. Often people think about these very visual, extreme, quick onset events like a cyclone in the Pacific or a flood. But what I wanted to talk about in terms of loss and damage is there are so many slow onset events that are actually resulting in the biggest types of loss and damage. So over here on the left, you can see this issue of desertification, which, believe it or not, is actually happening in the Pacific Islands as we remove forests through logging and timber and other changes to natural ecosystems. We are experiencing desertification. There's the loss of biodiversity, which has incredible impacts on subsistence, economies, and cultural identities, tribes and totems that relate to particular plants and animals. The next wedge in the wheel is around land degradation through unsustainable farming practices and or climate regimes. There are issues with glaciers. There's ocean acidification, which in the Pacific region is a silent killer. Nothing is physically happening on the reef, but the reef is dying because of the increased carbonic acid content in the seawater around the reef. Of course, sea level rise is a very slow process, millimeters per year, but that causes over time incredible catastrophic damage to our low-lying atoll nations and even communities in high islands that live on the coast. Then you've got salinization, and we saw that in the movie from the Solomon Islands, where seawater through sea level rise is actually creeping into the freshwater lens under the islands. And then, of course, rising temperatures. So these are very slow, almost imperceptible climate changes, which are having catastrophic, devastating consequences in terms of loss and damage. And then the extreme weather events over on the right-hand side, of course, our tropical cyclones and our floods and our droughts and our heat waves, our storm surge. These events tend to happen on quite a short time scale. So you can see the sudden onset events or the extreme events, they could be on a time scale of hours or days, maybe a week in the case of a drought, weeks or months. And then you get into these slow onset processes, the sea level rise and the ocean acidification and the temperature, which are months, years, and even decades. So we're not, in terms of science, really able to quantify or qualify the extent of loss and damage from some of these harder to measure, harder to observe slow onset processes. The next slide I've got here is looking at the types of either slow onset or extreme events that you could find in the Pacific at different locations. So for example, a storm surge would be a fast onset or an extreme event right on the coast, whereas something like a heat wave would affect some of our villages up in the mountains and hills in the high islands. Ocean acidification is a slow onset event, which happens obviously in the marine environment. But then you've also got these increasing temperatures happening up in the mountains and the hills, or land degradation happening on land. So really everywhere on the islands, you could experience both slow onset climate events as well as extreme events. Next, this slide here is getting more into the idea of economic and non-economic losses and damages. And so often what is published and what we hear about from governments are the economic losses and damages. So after, for example, a major cyclone, the governments of the region will work with SPC and the World Bank and other technical partners to do a post-disaster needs assessment, where they will do a fantastic job of quantifying the economic losses to agricultural production and the number of houses damaged and destroyed, and tourism, business, etc. But what's very rarely quantified in terms of the real loss and damage are these non-economic losses. So how do you, for example, quantify a non-economic loss of life? I mean, what is the value of a Pacific Island person who has lost their life because of a climate extreme or a slow onset event. I mean, it's intangible and invaluable. The health of an individual. So maybe a heat wave has caused an elderly person to have an asthma attack, or they can't do as much work. How do you value that non-economic loss to their productivity because of their health complication, climate health complication? A lot of us who are in this room have been doing a lot of work on human mobility. Okay, so the humans survive, they're still healthy, but you've taken them away from their ancestral land, where their totems are, and where their custom stories emerge from, and where their ancestors are buried. How do you value that loss by moving person from A to B, although they're still a healthy person? So these are just some examples. In terms of society, there's been a lot of talk in the Pacific about losing territory to sea level rise and other extreme events. Our intangible cultural heritage. So here in Vanuatu, we've got as natural and cultural heritage, our sand drawings, some of our protected areas, our wetlands. What happens when you lose those? I mean, how do you value a sand drawing that is no longer exists because that particular species has been wiped out by climate change? Indigenous knowledge. When you have changes to the climate, then the knowledge that has been associated with that natural feature or that system is lost because it's no longer relevant. And so how do you value the loss of that traditional knowledge and our cultural identity? And of course, putting a value on biodiversity is very hard because we take biodiversity and ecosystem services for granted. We breathe clean air and we drink fresh water and we eat fresh food from the sea, the coral reef, and the forest. And when that's damaged or lost or destroyed because of climate change, there is a huge value that no one's really taking the serious time and effort to quantify and to publicly state to the world. So I think it's very important that when we talk about loss and damages, we in the Pacific are always bringing up non-economic loss and damages and giving real examples from the civil society stakeholders we work with and our constituents. I mean, the only way that we're going to get change in finance for loss and damage, for example, is if we can start to bring up the real hidden costs of loss and damage, the non-economic losses. So I wanted to give you a very quick overview of something exciting that has just happened in the Pacific. For quite a while now, we've been particularly concerned about the loss of our territory. So as you're aware, the law of the sea sets very clear protocols for establishing the maritime boundaries of a country. It's often based on land points, and then a certain distance from that land point is the extent that you can claim as your maritime boundary. And obviously with climate change is if you start to lose those land-based points, then so too your entire marine boundary shrinks. And that can happen in a matter of years or a decade, that you could lose thousands of kilometers of your territorial waters. And so in the Pacific, this has always been a concern. What happens as sea level rise eats away at these critical boundary points? And I'm very excited that the Pacific, on the 6th of August, just a couple of months ago, the leaders released a declaration on preserving maritime zones in the face of sea level rise. And basically, you can read the declaration, it's only a couple of pages, but these 3 key points sum it up. First of all, the leaders have declared that in accordance with the law of the sea, their zones that they have established are going to be maintained no matter what happens with sea level rise. So they've defined their zones in accordance with the law of the sea. Doesn't matter from this point forward, if sea level rise eats those land markers, their zones are maintained. They also declare that they have no intention to review and update their baselines. So their outer limits are their outer limits. There's going to be no review. This is it forever and ever. Kiribati will maintain its maritime boundary regardless of what happens to land within that maritime boundary. And they also proclaim, as a key part of this declaration, that they will continue to apply those boundaries and their rights and their entitlements, notwithstanding anything that happens with climate change. So very powerful counter to what could have been catastrophic loss and damage to sovereignty in the Pacific due to sea level rise. In terms of the convention itself, why is it important that we even discuss loss and damage? And my point of view is that loss and damage is actually the measuring stick for the entire convention. So if you have a convention and you're implementing it well and it's actually successful, there will be no loss and damage. But the fact that we are now experiencing more and more loss and damage means that there's something not right in terms of the effectiveness of the UNFCCC. Either there's something not right with mitigation, we're not mitigating enough, which we're clearly not, or there's something not right with adaptation. There's not enough happening, and clearly that's the case. So loss and damage needs to be a discussion within the UNFCCC as the measuring stick for the entire convention. Yes, so mitigation is the primary way that we minimize loss and damage. So the only way, the primary way really that we're going to stop seeing loss and damage is if we get greenhouse gas emissions to a safe level in the atmosphere. Reduce gas emissions to zero, and then reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's it. That's the only way. Unfortunately, because of our current and historical emissions, we've locked ourselves in to some pretty serious changes. And therefore, we need to adapt as much as possible to those changes, which helps us to avert and minimize some of the loss and damage. Anything that happens beyond those adaptation activities and beyond the mitigation efforts, that's the residual, as we spoke about, residual loss. And that's why we have to keep saying, you see, this is the measuring stick, we're failing, we need to do more. So it's a very important discussion. Equally important is that we do not conflate in any way or mix loss and damage with adaptation, because that is exactly what rich developed country parties want us to do, is to say, oh, loss and damage is just an extension of adaptation. If we invest more in adaptation, we don't have to talk about loss and damage, you'll be fine. And that's exactly the opposite of what we in the Pacific were saying. We are already in the Pacific overwhelmed dealing with mitigation. We are already overwhelmed with policy on climate change. We are overwhelmed trying to get adaptation responses out to our most vulnerable people and communities. Loss and damage is a separate and tertiary burden. After we've done absolutely the best we can, there's still going to be destruction and catastrophe. And so we cannot conflate loss and damage and adaptation. I'll give you an example. At the beginning of the year, the UK presidency wanted to have the major theme on adaptation and resilience for success of COP26. And we in the Pacific, along with many partners around the world, said COP26 will be a failure if you only speak about adaptation and resilience. We must bring loss and damage into the political dialogue of COP26, and you, the presidency, have to acknowledge and fight to increase the profile of loss and damage and see landing in loss and damage. Otherwise, we will see a total loss of COP26 or a failure of COP26. So please bear this in mind, that there are some very sweet arguments people will try to make, particularly to us, civil society, and say, why don't you make a statement about, the links between adaptation and loss and damage? Be very careful that these are completely blend or hide one under the other. Okay, in terms of the Pacific, as I mentioned before, we have been at the forefront of loss and damage since the very beginning of the UNFCCC. Vanuatu raised through AOSIS the proposal that we put a loss and damage insurance mechanism into the convention itself. It was actually in 1991, there were negotiations going on to say what should go into the UNFCCC, and AOSIS proposed, A, there should be a fund to address the impacts of sea level rise, basically, and B, that fund should get its money from insurance. So we talked in the last session about the value of insurance. That was actually the original proposal, was there would be money available for countries suffering sea level rise impacts, and that insurance pool would provide insurance against sea level rise. Sadly, neither of those two proposals made it to the convention. Neither the insurance pool or the international fund made it in. Hence, here we are at COP26 still talking about finance for loss and damage. How are we going to pay for losses and damages that are caused by the emissions of rich developed countries? Who's going to foot the bill? So when did we actually get loss and damage really into the convention? That didn't happen until 2013. So this was at COP29 when we fought very hard to develop something called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And the Warsaw International Mechanism, also called the WIM, is the main vehicle whereby the UNFCCC looks at and addresses the issue of loss and damage. So technically, the WIM is supposed to do a whole bunch of things. It's supposed to support action, which, when we talk about support, we're talking about finance and capacity building and technology. It's supposed to actually support action to address loss and damage in the most vulnerable countries. It's supposed to do efforts for coordination and get lots of players and partners talking about loss and damage. It's supposed to convene meetings, promote and do all kinds of analyses and research and synthesizations. And I mean, it's supposed to be the center of excellence. It's supposed to provide technical guidance and make recommendations. Now, that's what it's supposed to do. Sadly, when we set up the WIM at COP20 in 2013, COP19, we didn't actually establish mechanisms for action. The only thing we set up would be the executive committee for the WIM. So although the WIM is supposed to do all this magical stuff, all we have is an executive committee. And the executive committee is made up of representatives who already have full-time jobs elsewhere. And they only meet about twice a year, and they only report once a year to COP. So you can see this already, this mismatch between what should happen and what actually happens, because we don't have the mechanism. We only have an executive committee, or the ExCom. So this is a major issue. Also in the convention, we've asked that there be contact points or focal points for loss and damage in every country, so that the ExCom and the WIM can reach out to them and support them. But many countries, even in the Pacific, still don't have a loss and damage contact point. So we really don't have the institutional makeup to see real action on loss and damage. I skipped over a slide here. I wanted to show you. We talked about insurance in the Pacific in the last session. So SPREP has done some fantastic work in looking at a Pacific Islands climate insurance facility in terms of feasibility and what that might look like. And certain countries in the Pacific, for example, Tuvalu, have actually legislated to set up loss and damage fund. So Tuvalu set up a survival fund back in 2015 that has had various levels of success. There's the PCRAFI, which is the Pacific Climate Risk, basically insurance facility, which is paying out some money when there's a major climate extreme event. It's not perfect, but so there is action happening within the Pacific, but I should note that all of this action is actually happening outside of the UNFCCC. This is happening bilaterally and regionally. The UNFCCC itself doesn't actually have these structures and mechanisms in place, other than the ExCom. And I also want to tell you about the ExCom itself, because it's a very funky body. The ExCom, when you think about an executive committee for loss and damage, you want people on there who are like action oriented, who are really wanting to see things done and support countries and bring in technical expertise and money and all that. Well, sadly, that's not what the ExCom looks like. The ExCom is 20 members. There are 10 of them from Annex 1 party. And if you remember, the Annex 1 parties are the developed country parties, the ones who are responsible for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And then there are 10 members from the non-Annex 1, who are the rest of us, the developing countries. And then they've tried to do geographical representation. But what you'll notice is basically what this is a perfect split between developed and developing. So what the ExCom turns into is basically another political space where you have one group against the other group, and they just argue and talk, and they can never really make significant action because it's not set up to actually be an action body. It's set up to be a political negotiation space. And this is one of the main failures of why we've called for something beyond the ExCom. And I'll tell you a little bit about the Santiago Network. Let me show you a couple of key faces in this slide. I don't know if you can see my pointer here. Very important people for the Pacific. We have Pepetua Latasi from Tuvalu. She is a member of the WIM ExCom. Also very important for us are the representatives of AOSIS. So we've got Dawn from St. Lucia here in the middle. And we've also got Leanne, who is from Jamaica, and she's actually one of the co-chairs of the executive committee of the WIM. Also important are some of our key partners from other groupings. So we've got Adao, who's from Timor-Leste, and he's the least developed country representative on the ExCom. And we've got Alpha and Sumaya, who are part of the African group, who are members of the ExCom of the WIM. And I should also point out some of our other partners who are not part of our groups, who sometimes make the work a little bit more difficult. We have the Australian representative, Russell. So Australia is a member of the ExCom. We've got the United States is a member of the ExCom. This is Farhan. Cornelia from the EU. And importantly, this is Malcolm, who's part of the UK, and he's being the presidency of COP26 plays a very important role. So you can see that we've got, very critical people. Some of them are aligned with our positions on loss and damage, and some of them are absolutely contradictory to our positions. But just so you know that this is the team that's really driving the only work that's happening on loss and damage under the convention. Okay, they have set a work plan. This the executive committee, has set a 5-year work plan to work on these 5 areas. The first one is slow onset events. So the things that we talked about at the beginning, the sea level rise and the ocean acidification and things like that. We've got non-economic losses that we've already spoken about. So there's a whole work stream on non-economic losses. Comprehensive risk management includes insurance. So there is a work stream looking at how we can include insurance and other risk management, risk transfer approaches. There's also a work stream on displacement, migration, planned relocation, which is an area of much importance to us in the Pacific. And finally, just at COP25 2 years ago, we got a work stream or a committee on action and support, which is finally looking at the finance, the technology, and the capacity building. So that's what the XCOM is working on, those 5 streams. And there are a couple of really important tools that have emerged from the WIM so far. One of them is a clearinghouse for risk transfer. And it's actually called the Fiji Clearinghouse because this was launched at COP23. And you can go onto this web portal and you can find out anything and everything about insurance and risk transfer. There's also, as part of this mechanism, there's also Risk Talk, which is an online exchange. So you can write a question, for example, what kind of insurance would work in Fiji? Or what kind of insurance could I get for small farmers? And then Risk Talk would actually reply to you to get tailor-made answers to your question. So very important tool that's not being used as much as it should, but as part of the WIM or the Warsaw International Organization. Another important group is the Task Force on Displacement that has been looking at how do we avert, minimize, and address this displacement issue. And they've had lots of meetings and they've put out reports and they've got a network of people who are working on displacement. So also very valuable part of the WIM for us in the Pacific. Now, in terms of the Paris Agreement, so all that is the convention. We've got the WIM under the UNFCCC. In terms of the Paris Agreement itself, we have a whole article, which is Article 8, on loss and damage. And this was a huge fight to get an article, a standalone article on loss and damage. Of course, our partners wanted to hide loss and damage under adaptation and just fund adaptation and just support adaptation. But we fought very hard to get Article 8. In exchange, sadly, we had to put a statement in the decision that said, okay, we get Article 8, but we cannot use Article 8 to get compensation or claim liability for loss and damage. And I'll talk a little bit more about that decision. In the Paris Agreement itself, there is language that recognizes these 3 words: averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. So all 3 of these words hold important meaning. And often when we are negotiating around action around loss and damage, we need to not forget one of these 3 words. So often people will talk about minimizing or averting through investment in renewable energy or minimizing through adaptation, but actually addressing loss and damage when it happens post-event, people love to forget this. So it's important that we always use this phrase, averting, addressing, and averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And also in the Paris Agreement, there's important language about what loss and damage includes, such as early warning system, emergency preparedness, slow onset events, irreversible events, the risk assessment side of things, insurance, non-economic losses, and then resilience. So all of those are articulated in decision CP1, CP21 about what loss and damage actually means in Article 8. Okay, the Article 8 recognizes the need for action, but it doesn't at all, any way, shape, or form make any progress on how do you finance loss and damage. So this has always been a sticking point in the negotiations, is the money for loss and damage. Finally, we're getting people to start to recognize the importance of loss and damage, but don't want to talk about how to finance it. So obviously, the developed countries, the rich developed countries, they want to talk about insurance, which puts the cost of loss and damage onto the private sector and the cost onto the people suffering. Oh, you're suffering, go buy some insurance. That'll cover you. So that takes away their financial responsibility. While we, in the developing world, we point out that not only is this insufficient, given the scale of losses, but this is inequitable. You're the ones who cause loss and damage. The polluter should pay for the compensation and liability. So that's the big sticking point in the Paris Agreement, is that it doesn't clearly articulate finance for loss and damage. And here's this infamous para 51. So in the decision text for the Paris Agreement, so there was the Paris Agreement itself, and then there was the decision that accompanied the agreement. It actually includes a exclusion clause, which says that the Article 8 shall serve not serve as a basis for liability or compensation. So you cannot, based on Article 8, claim one country to pay for another country's loss and damage. There have been different legal interpretations of that clause. Some scholars say, you know what, there's still an opening for compensation under the climate regime as raised by SIDS and others in terms of developing financial system. There have also been some proposals put forth on compensation frameworks, but basically it's just been a non-starter. Nobody in the rich developed world wants to talk about it at all. Okay, interestingly, many countries in the Pacific, at least 4, Nauru, Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, when they ratified the Paris Agreement, they made an explicit clause in their ratification statement that said they do not waive any current or future rights to compensation, climate change, loss, and damage. So we said, yeah, we agreed to the Paris Agreement. However, we're hanging on to the possibility for compensation. So congratulations to Nauru, Marshalls, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu for doing that, which leaves the door open for some sort of compensation mechanism in the future. Okay, in terms of the negotiation challenges, obviously loss and damage has become highly politicized because it has to do with, 1, historical responsibility. Some countries are responsible. And 2, it has to do with money. Who's going to foot the bill for the massive amounts of loss and damage, which are like 100 times more than the cost of adaptation, or 100 times more than the cost of mitigation, is dealing with the mess. So it's highly politicized. There is a reluctance of some countries, the US, Australia, the countries that are most responsible, for engaging on any kind of discussion around support, because they're afraid of liability and compensation. They're afraid that we're going to go back and say, okay, for the last 80 years, you've been responsible for most greenhouse gas emissions, so you're 80% responsible for compensating for our cyclone damage. So you see how there's this fear, which makes it very challenging to negotiate. There's also some potential overlaps and synergies between loss and damage in the Paris Agreement and in the Convention, and loss and damage in other international frameworks. So for example, the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction actually does talk about humanitarian support after a disaster, which is something like loss and damage. So a lot of people say, oh, well, let's not talk about it in UNFCCC, you just go talk about it in the Sendai Framework. But we've already said, no, we have to talk about it in UNFCCC because loss and damage is the measuring stick for the effectiveness of the convention and the success of the Paris Agreement. Okay, there's also this kind of fear that if we acknowledge loss and damage as being a real issue, then we've acknowledged that the convention itself has failed. So people are afraid to say, oh, we failed in the convention, which I actually think that this is important that we do so that we can start doing things differently. There have been some issues with the attribution issue of loss and damage. So it's very difficult for climate scientists to say this event, this cyclone, this flood, this heat wave is due to climate change. So for a long time, many parties said, oh, you can't say that that was because of climate change, that cyclone, so therefore we're not responsible for that loss and damage. But now more and more, scientists have been able to pinpoint with increasing accuracy the amount of attribution for a single cyclone due to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's why legal challenges have been emerging more and more. In the last weeks, there are more court cases where individuals are claiming compensation for a climate issue because you can attribute it to a specific storm and you can attribute it to a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's getting very refined, and I think we're going to see more and more of this attribution coming up in the future. And then also loss and damage is a challenge because it's not just about acknowledging loss and damage, it's about the means of implementation. It's about the finance for loss and damage, the technology, the capacity for loss and damage. So it's not just as simple as Article 8, but it actually affects every other article in the Paris Agreement. All right, so at COP26, what do we expect to see? What can we expect to hear about in terms of loss and damage? Okay, we have finance for loss and damage is going to be a major discussion point. And at COP26, as I mentioned, we are going to start to talk about the new global goal on climate finance. So the current global goal is 100 billion US dollars per year mobilized globally. And that goal extends to 2025. Well, now here at COP 2021, we're going to start talking about the goal that happens from 2026 on. We know already that the goal has to be a floor of 100 billion per year, but we don't know anything else about that goal. Should that goal include special finance for loss and damage? Should it include mechanisms like insurance to meet that goal? I mean, all of that we're going to start talking about now at CMA 3 or COP26 this year. Is what is that new global goal going to start to look at? It's going to be very important that we get ideas about loss and damage into that new global goal. There's also an agenda item happening at COP26 around the Standing Committee on Finance. So the Standing Committee on Finance, as we heard from the last session, is a body that looks at all matters related to the finance mechanism of the convention and the Paris Agreement. And they just put together a report about the needs of developing countries. So what do we in the Pacific need in terms of climate finance to address all the climate issues we're facing? Mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So this report, they're going to present it to the COP or to the SBs, and we're going to have to react to that report. We're going to have to say, yep, that report's good, covers all of our needs, all done. Or we're going to have to be ready to stand up and say, whoa, 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 whoa. This report doesn't say anything about loss and damage, or it doesn't include non-economic loss and damage. It doesn't include how we're going to source the finance. So this is our chance when they discuss this report to actually respond in terms of loss and damage finance. So I think the finance issue is going to come out really important. And then there's always a standing agenda item at COP where we give our guidance to the operating entities of the financial mechanism. So we, as the parties, are going to give instructions to the Global Environment Facility and to the Green Climate Fund. And we're going to tell them things that they need to do better. One of those things they might have to do better is to open up another funding window for loss and damage. Or maybe they need to give better guidance on how you can use the existing windows for loss and damage. Or maybe we need to scale up the amount of loans, grants versus loans for loss and damage. So this is our chance during this agenda item, which is in finance, not loss and damage, to get some of the real finance for loss and damage issues worked out. Okay, there's another big negotiating issue, which may or may not be discussed at COP26, and that is the governance of the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism. So the WIM, if you remember, it was set up under the convention itself. It was actually set up under the Cancun Adaptation Framework. So believe it or not, loss and damage came from an adaptation background. But anyway, so we set it up under the UNFCCC. But then we also put loss and damage, Article 8, under the Paris Agreement. So there's a question, which body do we talk about the WIM with? Do we talk about it at the COP, which looks after the UNFCCC? Or do we talk about loss and damage at the CMA, which looks after the Paris Agreement? Or do we talk about it under both? So we in the Pacific and most of our negotiating partners prefer that we have dual governance of the WIM, which means that both governing bodies, the COP and the CMA, they both talk about it. Because the more you talk about an issue, the more there's a chance that you can get good outcomes or more ambition. If it's only under one place, then it could get hidden or sidetracked or something. But if it's everywhere under both bodies, then there's a possibility that we could get more ambition. And as I said, G77 in China, LDCs, AOSIS, ILAC, AGN, they're all requesting that we have dual governance. So that could be a fight, it may not, we'll see. Then, most important from my perspective is how do we get the convention and the Paris Agreement to actually implement loss and damage support? So the XCOM, okay, great. They've done some studies, they've produced some toolkits, they've put up a website, they've looked at insurance, but how does that actually help us in the Pacific if we've got a loss and damage issue? Who do we go to? Do we call the executive committee of the WIM and say, come down and help us? No, they've got full-time jobs elsewhere. That's not their mandate. So what we fought very hard for at COP25, and Vanuatu and the Pacific were leaders in this debate, was that we needed to set up a network, a mechanism that was an actual implementation and finance arm for loss and damage. And we called that arm the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. And the idea is that this arm would actually be a organization that you could call or request, and they would respond to your request for your in-country need. So if there was a major climate disaster in Cook Islands or something huge happened in Papua New Guinea, and they needed some technical support around loss and damage, they could call the SNLD and they would provide that. The actual language in the decision was that the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, which is the SNLD, has a mandate to catalyze technical assistance for the implementation of approaches to avert, minimize, and address. So very sneaky language in here. Catalyze technical existence in the view of our rich developed country parties means they don't actually have to do anything in terms of finance or on-ground support. They just catalyze it through this SNLD, which could mean anything. It might mean they make a phone call to the Red Cross and the Red Cross does it. But that's not what we in the developing world were envisioning. We were envisioning a process where there would be dedicated resources, dedicated technical experts, dedicated responses so that a country could get support as they need. What we don't have yet is the structure and the function of the network. So the COP decision in Madrid said it's established. But what does that mean? Like, where does it sit? Who's the secretariat? Is there a budget? None of that has been set up. And that's what we're doing. Something called the operationalization of the Santiago Network. How do we actually create a real thing? So the UK and the Chilean presidencies have had lots of discussions over the last year and a half since we've been locked down by COVID. No decisions, no negotiations, but discussions. So at COP26, we've got to answer some big questions. The first is, when and how will this network actually be operationalized? Will it happen now at COP26? Will we take a decision that says, okay, here's the structure? Or will we have a process whereby we set it up next year? We don't know yet. Will this interim SNLD be held by the Secretariat of the UNFCCC? And they're also busy. They've got other jobs. Do we trust them to set this up? Or do we need to have the support of an external body with like a funded secretariat sitting within a UN body? So all these questions, and this is critical, are going to come out at COP26. We're also asking for at COP26 that we have a standing agenda item within the COP and the SBs to talk about loss and damage. Given that it's so important and every year there's more and more loss and damage, it's now time that we make this a standing agenda item. So there would have to be a decision at COP and CMA that now forever and ever there's an agenda on loss and damage, which right now we don't have. So we're also possibly discussing at COP26 guidance on loss and damage for NDCs. And if you recall, the NDC is the nationally determined contribution, or the position that every country takes to the Paris Agreement, which basically says this is what we're going to do. Loss and damage is not yet a requirement in the NDC. The only thing that's a requirement is mitigation or greenhouse gas emissions and some sort of statement about finance mobilized or received. But in terms of adaptation, in terms of loss and damage, there's no real requirements for an NDC. So what if we make it at this COP26 a requirement that every country has to say something about loss and damage, either how they're supporting loss and damage, or the support towards loss and damage, or they're receiving loss and damage, or their needs. So wouldn't that be incredible if we could have that? So that could possibly be a negotiation topic. Again, so many parties have put forward positions on loss and damage, and I encourage you to go to the UNFCCC website, so unfccc.int, and have a look at something called the submissions portal, where you'll be able to see not only different countries, but also the negotiating blocks. So if you go on there, you can read AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States positions around loss and damage. You can read from the LDCs, you can read from the African group, and you can even read from our other partners from the Umbrella Group or the European Union, what their thoughts on the Santiago Network are. And there's differing opinions, and this is what will be the basis of negotiations coming up in Scotland. I also wanted to recall the CAN position paper with 5 key elements for COP26, not just loss and damage, but 5 elements. Loss and damage is one of them. And I'll tell you what some of those positions are. Let me give you some quotes, though, from some key people who are talking about loss and damage. This is Salim. He's the director of a climate academic center in Bangladesh. And some of the words he's using are incredibly ambitious. And these are the kinds of words that civil society is often echoing. I believe the world is now entering the era of loss and damage. So we're leaving the era of impacts, leaving the era of adaptation, and entering the world of loss and damage. He's also said that compensating loss and damage isn't something new. We shouldn't be afraid of compensation. He gave the example of the United States. So after every major cyclone in the United States, the federal government actually compensates cities and states to address the damage that they have suffered. So he's saying here, that's the same thing that we need at the global level. The only question is, who do we send the bill to? Do we send it to those responsible? Do we send it to the UN? We just need the same mechanism that happens already in every country at the global level. And then this third quote I've got here, he says, we really need to apply this polluter pays principle on the fossil fuel companies. So it's really a small number of companies that are making billions of dollars of profit by polluting the planet and thus causing loss and damage. So he says it's morally wrong, and he's long proposed a loss and damage tax on fossil fuel companies on their profits, so that it wouldn't be passed on to the consumer, but it would actually be a tax on the profits of the fossil fuel companies. And he says we need this under the UNFCCC, not as an external mechanism, but something that the UNFCCC process agrees to under the WIM. Leanne Roper, as I mentioned, she's a member, she's the co-chair of the ExCom of the WIM. She's also the lead negotiator on loss and damage for AOSIS. And she's made a lot of statements about the sacrifices that everybody's going to have to make, and the fact that there are limits to adaptation. So we can't just keep living in a dream world that adaptation is the only answer, that there are hard, concrete limits that mean loss and damage. This is Harjeet Singh. He's one of the policy directors of CAN International, and he is a big advocate for finance on loss and damage. He says there has been almost no progress on the issue of finance and loss and damage. And what he wants is for member states to the UNFCCC to recognize the devastation that's already happening. So right now, this kind of devastation is not being presented in a proper way to the UNFCCC or to the Paris Agreement CMA. So what he wants is for rich countries to stop ignoring what's going on in the most vulnerable developing countries. So he says that the whole process, the whole negotiation process is about enabling survival and response to climate emergency. And so we've got to see more action from these rich developing countries. This is Greta. We all know Greta. She has talked about loss and damage many times. She gave this quote about the suffering of the many is actually paid for, pays for the luxury of the few. So it's a few companies, a few countries, a few individuals that are causing the suffering of everybody, the loss and damage of everybody. And this last quote, people are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing, we're having a mass extinction. And yet, all you want to talk about is money and the fairy tale of eternal economic growth. So she's saying, guys, our planet is collapsing. We've got loss and damage in every country of the world at every level. And yet we're still talking about economic growth as the driver of development. So, and she says, how dare you? These are real powerful voices. Over the next days, there are going to be some important discussions. So CAN International, Robin Hood Tax, Make Polluters Pay, and Loss and Damage Collaboration, they're doing this webinar on a new loss and damage tax. And I would encourage you guys all to join that. It's explaining it in detail how this tax would actually garner money for loss and damage without being passed on to fossil fuel users. Because a lot of people say, oh, if you tax fossil fuels, then we, the poor people, are going to have to pay for the higher cost of fuel. So this proposal is actually showing how the tax doesn't affect the consumer. The untold story that I showed you from Solomon Islands, there's going to be a big event on the realities of loss and damage also happening on the 23rd. Which you can join, and we'll have Gladys and Solomon joining from the Pacific. There is a big youth gathering happening on the 23rd and 24th here in the Pacific, where some incredible, powerful speakers are going to be talking about all issues related to COP26, including several sessions on loss and damage. I think Margareta is going to be speaking, and others who are in this call. So don't miss that. That'll be the 23rd and 24th this week. So with that, we've got 15 minutes left, so I thought I would close and open up for some discussions and questions. I see some incredible loss and damage experts on the call here, so please feel free to add things that I've missed or relevant points. Thanks so much. Over to you, Atina, for facilitating.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris, for that comprehensive breakdown of loss and damage and all the issues surrounding it. Before we open up the floor, I just want to make some quick announcements. After this, we will be going into the lunch period and we'll rejoin at 1 p.m. Vanuatu time. So that would be 2 p.m. In Fiji time. So we'll open up the floor for questions and comments, and we'll have after that we'll break for lunch. I also want to let you guys know that we're still going to be using the same link for the next session, which will be led by sorry, what was the next session again? Was it adaptation and mitigation, which will be led by Espen. So that's happening at 2 p.m. So now that that's done, floor is open for questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, may I start? This is Mahendra. Yes, okay. Well, first of all, Chris, thank you for an amazing presentation. That was extremely comprehensive, very clear, and I think you charted very admirably the history and the key issues and so on. I mean, I think that was great. Look forward to receiving your presentation as well, so that we can have it for records. Two questions. One, hopefully a very simple one. The current target, 100 billion. How much of that has been collected? I mean, I see all sorts of figures that about 10, 12 billion, which has gone to GCF and agencies, but there are others who are now saying, oh, through very dubious ways in which they can count finance, it's actually closer to the $100 billion mark. The second point is in relation to the loss and damage inclusion in NDCs. I think the suggestion that, yeah, it could be made mandatory is okay, but currently I think there's nothing stopping countries from including that. And I'm certainly encouraging many of the countries where I am sort of assisting or being asked to assist, and I was assisted with a lot of the INDCs, that really it's your NDC, and really you should feel free to say anything. And I think it'll make a huge statement if many of the vulnerable countries, you know, spend a significant portion of the NDCs talking about this loss and damage. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Mahendra. Look, on the issue of finance, there are so many sneaky ways for rich developed countries to say that they've provided and mobilized finance, when in fact that finance is not real finance. It's loans that goes back to those countries with interest, or utilizes those countries' companies and individuals and experts. The latest report, and Espen is on the call, and we'll hear from Exley, I'm sure, is that we're nowhere near the 100 billion per year by 2020. And reminder that 100 billion per year is from all sources. That's not just public finance, but that's private finance and etc. And even then, we haven't reached the 100 billion. In terms of the NDCs, I have yet to see an NDC that does a really good job of loss and damage. And I feel like we in the Pacific should be the area that does that. And now that all political partners are calling for revised and enhanced NDCs before COP26, I would love it if even 2 or 3 Pacific countries would just put in a revised NDC and say, it may not be revised in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, but look at all this loss and damage priority we've put in. And I think we as Pacific civil society definitely play a role in calling for our Pacific governments to think about doing that kind of thing. But yeah, thank you so much for those comments.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. Thank you, Dr. Chris. We have another question here from Macareta. She says there has been efforts to make progress.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry. Hello.
I can hear you, Margaret. You can go ahead.
You can hear me. Okay, there have been 2 UN reports by the rapporteurs, one on environmental rights and one on non-economic loss. I remember that we did a submission on the letter. David Boyd, who did the one on environmental rights, came to Fiji and met with different groups, and we also, as a combined NGO CSO group, we also gave our submission to him. And subsequent to that, I think there was some progress regarding LND. I'm not sure, there was a recommendation there, but the one that may be of interest, where there's definitely been some movement, is the one on non-economic loss. I think it started off as the rapporteur on cultural rights, and then we slotted in non-economic loss submissions there. Are you able to sort of give us an update on what's happening there?
No, I don't have the latest. I think probably you would be in the best position. I was actually just looking on Google now. You can review the report. So if you go to the ohchr.org, then there's a whole section on human rights, climate change, and migration. There's a special page there, so you can actually read the two reports. And also there were several workshops. There was a workshop on slow onset events. There was a panel discussion on human rights and migrants. And then there was the report in April. There was also a resolution about research gaps. So that's where I can see the reports. But no, in terms of where we're going in that space, I'm not up to date. If anybody else on the call has an idea, that'd be great to hear.
Can I ask another question? Non-economic loss is, very important for Pacific, in terms of our affinity to our land and our natural environment. And yet, there's not much that I see that's happening there. It will be a very interesting place for us to get into. I know that the Fiji climate change bill has a few things there, but it's still in bill form. But the big issue for me and others is that in order to know what you are losing and to strengthen your advocacy and your bargaining points, you need to know what you have lost. So that means doing an assessment of what are your non-economic assets, or something like a national audit. Do you know if that is being done anywhere in the Pacific?
That is a fantastic. Go ahead.
Yeah,
sorry.
I know that in the Cook Islands, some years back, there's mentioned in some of the publications that they gave out, iPads to people, and for them to keep track of what they see as being lost, the sea level rise, the loss of land, the salination of their water and arable lands. That to me was a very good, activity, and not expensive, so that the people who are actually losing things are able to to assess for themselves and tell us, rather than someone coming in from the urban area and doing surveys and such things. Yeah.
No, I think these are fantastic suggestions. I am not aware of any major national level account of loss and damage. Bangladesh has set up a national loss and damage mechanism with exactly that purpose, to identify methodologies and approaches for quantifying loss and damage, as well as being a focal or first point of response for any loss and damage issues within the country. In the Pacific, I think we're doing interesting work on vulnerability assessments, but it doesn't go as far as capturing baselines on what is potentially being lost and what is already being lost. I know at the Climate Justice Summit last month, Professor Villi at USP PACE was talking about starting some of these studies, these quantification studies of loss and damage. But in terms of a national level program, I have yet to see a Pacific Island country roll this out in any meaningful way. So definitely agree with you that this is a major need, particularly for non-economic losses, the harder ones to quantify. After a disaster, everybody does a PDNA and they count houses damaged and crops destroyed. But how do you actually calculate those non-economic losses of cultural identity, or loss of health or working capacity, or all that needs to be quantified, and we need to tell stories. So maybe we don't have scientific methodologies yet, but I think every single NGO and CSO in the Pacific has a responsibility to start telling the stories about what people are seeing and experiencing, even if it's not quantifiable or scientific yet. Get those stories out there, because that's then going to lead the finance and the technology and support to start to do those national level accounts that you've requested. Excellent suggestion.
Do we have any more questions from the floor?
I might just say one other thing, which has a lot to do with finance for loss and damage. We hear developed country parties lament the fact that their economies are shrinking and they just can't pay for all this stuff. But I just want to highlight two contrary facts that refute those statements. The first is, in COVID, countries mobilized trillions of dollars in public finance to address the COVID crisis. So why can't we mobilize the same level of finance for loss and damage, which in my view has the same potential loss of life, the same potential loss of economy as the COVID crisis? So there should be nothing stopping a global response equivalent to the COVID crisis, but for climate loss and damage. The second point is that every year, developed and developing country parties mobilize trillions of dollars in fossil fuel subsidies. So I think the latest estimate was 1.3 trillion US dollars per year in public finance to support the fossil fuel industry. Yet we cannot even mobilize 100 billion per year, which doesn't even include loss and damage yet, for adaptation and mitigation. I mean, that to me is morally bankrupt. And so we need to be, when developed country parties say, oh, we just can't afford to talk about this, then we need to call them out and say, well, how many trillions did you put into your fossil fuel industry this year? Our nearest neighbors are subsidizing fossil fuel. And yet here we in the Pacific are losing, catastrophic amounts of our intangible heritage and livelihoods. So I just wanted to make that point very quickly about the hypocrisy around finance for loss and damage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris, for that. Oh, sorry. Oh, we've got one question from Romabeth. Romabeth, would you like to unmute so you could ask your question?
Hi, just in relation to the $100 billion that we might possibly get, I just wanted to know, how can we ensure monies are going towards sustainable investments and making sure it does not exacerbate the debt crisis and aggravate climate change in the process, but actually facilitates a green recovery?
Hey, Roma, thank you so much. Good morning. This is an excellent question. So the goal is that we mobilize 100 billion per year, but there's very little in terms of defining how that 100 billion is spent if we ever get to 100 billion. So what would happen, say, for example, if a country mobilized a whole bunch of money to invest in what they're calling clean coal or sustainable natural gas, which, as we all know, is just totally untrue, yet they're using this money, this climate money, for investing in that, which is not going to lead to green recovery or sustainable development. So I think this is a real example of what's happening with this money. And that's why this new global finance goal that we're going to start to negotiate at COP26, we've got to be much clearer in how this money should be used. In terms of exacerbating the debt crisis, I think for a long time now, many developing countries have been calling for a very high percentage of grants in the overall climate finance mix. And I think right now, we're not even at 50% of grants versus loans. I think there's probably more loans available at interest rates that may or may not be market rates than there are for grants. And that is definitely going to exacerbate the debt crisis if you have loans. Because at the end of the day, it's the rich developed countries that are not only getting the money back, but they're getting it back with interest. So it defeats the whole point of mobilizing finance for the developing world if you have debt instruments. So thank you very much for raising those. And in terms of loss and damage, if the finance needs are put on the shoulders of the people suffering, then I feel like we've missed the boat. If you're expecting a farmer or a fisherman or a woman, a weaver or a handicraft maker to shoulder the costs of the loss and damage that has been caused by another country, then I think we're living in another reality. We have to make sure that the burden of paying the cost of loss and damage falls squarely on the people who are responsible. And those people are the countries and the companies that operate in those countries that are increasing greenhouse gas emissions, even today, expanding. Great question.
Can I make another sort of another comment or question? Yeah, Chris, in terms of strategies for COP26, I mean, obviously, Vanuatu delegation would be extremely grateful for the sort of inputs you may be able to provide to the national delegation. I mean, you know, in all sorts of issues like the San Diego network on LND, operationalizing the mechanism and so on and so forth. But of course, I think the problem, of course, as you know, and I know from a number of countries, is we know the issue. We just talk about the issue at a very general level, loss and damage. But then what specifically can be done and how this relates to some of the key elements in the negotiations that you talked about in the CMA, the Paris and UNFCCC and the convention and so on, and where our delegations need to be visible and loud to ensure that these messages are heard, or at least put. I don't even think many of our leaders in the Pacific are really up to the mark, and when it comes to ministerial sort of dialogue, which eventually, as you know, happens. So does PICAN or CAN have a strategy where some of these useful notes or background information can be provided directly to the delegations? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mahendra. So I think next week we'll be launching the Pacific COP26 demands, which will include very tangible, very specific calls for the negotiations themselves, not general statements. There will be some general statements and general calls, but also for this COP. And the idea then would be that our membership, basically every civil society in the Pacific would be able then to approach their national delegations with some of these calls that are relevant to their activities. And certainly PICAN will be doing that from a top-down level. And hopefully the members will be doing it from a bottom up with their own national delegations. And somewhere in the middle, maybe some of these calls will be heard and a Pacific minister or two will make these statements at that high political level. But ideally, that's how that will work. And I think if we work together, civil society and governments, then we can achieve some of those goals. But yeah, very good point.